He lifted his glass and called my pension beer money. The whole table laughed. I set my fork down. I finished my coffee. $4,100 a month. He called it beer money. He didn't know where it came from. He didn't know about the trust. He didn't know about the note. He didn't know his own brewery was 4 months behind and sinking. He didn't know the man he was mocking was the only thing standing between him and the bank taking his tanks. 3 weeks later, at my daughter's table, a woman named Marjorie opened a folder. She read one sentence out loud. Chase Merrick's face went the colour of drywall paste. That's when I finally said something. I said, I don't chase a short with a raised voice. I follow it quiet. And I find it every time. But before the folder, there was the toast. Let me take you back 3 weeks. My name is Wendell Voss. I am 70 years old. I did not raise my voice at that table. I did not need to. I was sitting at the end of my own daughter's dinner table. My son-in-law lifted his glass. He called my pension beer money. The whole table laughed like he'd said something true. Paige is my daughter. She's 38. She used to correct her teachers when they got a fact wrong, even in second grade. Polite about it, but she corrected them. That girl doesn't live in my daughter anymore. Somewhere in the last 12 years, she learned to stare at her plate instead. Her husband is named Chase Merrick, 41 years old, owns half a taproom in Anders Junction, 16 miles from Redbud Crossing, the town I've lived in my whole life. He raised his glass that Sunday. He said, here's to the old man and his pension. God knows a little beer, money never hurt anybody. Everybody at that table laughed. My own daughter laughed. Not loud, just enough. I've built things with my hands since I was 19 years old. I know what load-bearing means. I know the difference between something that looks solid and something that is solid. That laugh was hollow. I heard it the second it left the room. I didn't argue. I never argue at a dinner table. I finished my potatoes. I told Paige the meal was good. I meant it. Doreen taught her how to cook a pork loin 30 years ago. Some things a mother teaches stick. Doreen was my wife. 30 years married before I lost her. She ran the counter at a place called the Rusty Cleat for 3 decades. Crab shack, out on the pier. Hard work. Long hours. She never once complained about the smell of the fryer in her hair. She painted the hulls of every boat we ever built a signature Dove grey. Her own mix. Men who never asked twice about anything asked her twice about that colour. They wanted it exact. She's been gone 3 years now. Cancer took her slow. I sat with her every night of it. I don't talk about that part much. Some things a man keeps folded small and puts away. 6 months before she passed, she said something at the kitchen table. I didn't understand it at the time. She said, Wendell, Chase counts other people's money like it already spends the same as his own. I didn't ask her what she meant. I should have. She was usually right about people. She was right about everything that mattered. I founded Voss Electrical Contracting 51 years ago. Out of a panel van, $180 of tools, and a torque wrench I still own. I want to say that plain. A man's whole life gets summarised down to a joke about beer money if he isn't careful. I am not going to let that happen here. I wired half the grain elevators in this county. I wired the rail yard switch house twice. Once when it was built. Once after the flood of '91 took the first job out. I trained 11 apprentices over 5 decades. Every one of them can still find a dead short by the smell of scorched insulation before I finish my coffee. That's not bragging. That's just a fact. The way a deed is a fact. The way a bank statement is a fact. 4 years ago, I sold the operating side of Voss Electrical to my shop foreman, a man named Ivan Koch, $610,000, structured as a note. I kept the shop building on Depot Street. I kept the land under it. I kept the note itself. Paid to me every month, $4,100. Same as clockwork, same as Ivan's word, which has never once needed checking. That's the beer money. $4,100 a month, from a business I built with my own hands over half a century. Paid faithfully by a man who learned everything he knows, standing next to me in a bucket truck. Chase didn't know the number. He didn't know where it came from. He just knew it was mine. And he wanted it to sound small. I want to tell you about the morning after that dinner. It tells you who I am better than any resume could. I drove into town the next day, like I do most mornings. I stopped at the grain bin for coffee. Old Delmar behind the bar was cursing at his breaker panel, fuse tripping every time he ran the ice machine and the coffee urn at once. I didn't say a word. I walked behind the bar, I opened the panel. I put my nose an inch from the wiring. I told him which breaker was undersized before I'd even pulled a screwdriver. $20 of parts. 40 minutes of my time. Free. That's what neighbours do in a town like Redbud Crossing. 2 men at the counter watched the whole thing. One of them, a farmer named Otto Prine, said, "Wendell, you could still run that whole shop blindfolded." I told him I probably could. I didn't say it to be proud, I said it because it's true. A man ought to know what he's still good for, especially at 70. Especially after people start deciding for him what he's still good for. That's the thing nobody at that dinner table understood. They think 70 means finished. They think a man who worked with his hands his whole life eventually just becomes a hand that shakes a little. Easy to guide, easy to steer into a chair and forget. I have watched exactly that happen to 2 men I knew growing up. I am not going to be the third. I want to tell you something else. I'm not going to explain it yet. It doesn't pay off for a while. 3 years ago, right after Doreen died, I drove to a lawyer's office 16 miles from here. I signed some papers nobody else in my family knows exist. I didn't tell Paige. I didn't tell Chase, obviously. I didn't even tell Ivan the whole shape of it, though he signed one line as a formality and never asked why. I'll tell you what was in those papers. Just not yet. Doreen said something to me the week before she died. Her voice was already thin from the medicine. I have thought about that sentence almost every day since. She said, "Wendell, if anyone ever calls what we built beer money, hand them the folder and let them count it themselves." I didn't know then what folder she meant. I do now. Paige wouldn't look at me at that dinner, not once. 12 years married to Chase, and my daughter has learned to go quiet at her own table. The same table her mother used to run like a foreman runs a job site. Loud and warm and certain. Doreen would have set her fork down the second Chase opened his mouth. She would have said something plain and true. She would have let it sit there in the room until it did its work. I'm not her. I don't have her gift for a fast, warm word that lands like a hammer. What I have is patience. 40 years of reading a blueprint before I ever pick up a tool. The ability to wait exactly as long as a job requires before I make my first cut. So I said nothing at that dinner. I ate my pork loin. I complimented my daughter's cooking. In the morning, I called a woman named Marjorie Doss, my attorney of 13 years. I told her it was time. Time for what, she asked me, though I think she already knew. Time to bring the folder to the next Sunday dinner, I said. Time to let them count it themselves. She didn't ask if I was certain. Marjorie Doss has known me 13 years. She knows I don't call her unless I'm certain. That morning, drinking coffee at my own kitchen table, Doreen's metronome sat silent on the mantel. I didn't know yet exactly how close Chase was standing to a fire. He had no idea I was already watching. I didn't know about the loan on his tap room. I didn't know about the 60-day letter from his equipment lender. I didn't know that my own daughter had let a doctor sign a letter sometime in the last 5 weeks. A doctor she'd never let me meet. A letter that called me confused. I'd find all of that out soon enough. And when I did, I didn't raise my voice then either. I want you to understand who I was before any of that. Not the man in a folder full of legal paper. The man who wired his own house, board by board, wire by wire, 40 years ago. Room by room, so that every switch in it still clicks the way I built it to click. The man who buried his wife 3 years ago and still keeps her metronome ticking on the mantel. Every evening at 6, she used to say a house needs a heartbeat even after the piano stops. That's who was sitting at that dinner table. A 41-year-old man who never built anything with his hands, raised a glass of his own beer. He called my life's work beer money. I let him finish his toast. I let the table laugh. Then I picked up my coffee. And I started planning the quietest Sunday dinner that family would ever sit through. Marjorie Doss keeps her office over the hardware store in Anders Junction, up a narrow flight of stairs that creaks on the 4th step, no matter how careful you are. I've been climbing those stairs for 13 years. I climbed them again on Monday morning, 2 days after the toast. My coffee was still bitter in the back of my throat. She had the folder out before I sat down. She always does that. 30 years of practicing law in a county this size teaches a person to read a client's face before he opens his mouth. She must have read something in mine. She didn't ask how I was. She just slid the folder across the desk. She said, "It's all still there, Wendell. Every dollar." I want to explain what was in that folder. plain. The way I'd explain a wiring diagram to an apprentice. 3 years ago, 6 months after I buried Doreen, I moved the note from Ivan into a trust. The shop building on Depot Street 2, the half-acre lot underneath it. A revocable trust. I named myself sole trustee. I named Ivan Koch as successor trustee. If something happens to me, Ivan runs it. Not my son-in-law. Not anybody who married into this family. $610,000. That's the face value of Ivan's note. $4,100 a month for another 11 years, paid straight into a trust account nobody else has ever seen the statements for. The shop building alone appraises at $240,000. The land under it, another $90,000. Depot Street backs right up to the rail spur. A developer offered to buy it twice in the last 5 years. I turned him down both times. That land was where I put in 40 years of Saturdays. It wasn't for sale then. It isn't now. Marjorie tapped the folder. She said, "This is airtight, Wendell. Nobody touches it without your signature or mine. Not Page, not Chase, not a court, unless somebody proves you're incompetent to manage your own affairs. There's nothing in this county's record that says that." I asked her straight out if she'd heard anything. She's the kind of lawyer who hears things. Small towns leak. Small town lawyers are where the leaks pool. She was quiet a second. Then she told me Chase's business partner had been in to see her, back in the spring, about restructuring some debt on the taproom. Not asking her to represent him, just asking around. The way a nervous man asks around when he already knows the answer he's going to get and wants a second opinion, he can ignore. $170,000. That's what Chase and his partner borrowed 2 years ago to expand Merrick Brewhouse. New tanks, a bigger cooler, seating out back, personally guaranteed against Chase and Page's own house. The equipment lender had already sent one warning letter. Marjorie didn't have the exact figure on the arrears, but she said it was bad enough. The partner had asked, point blank, what happens to a business's collateral if the guarantor's father-in-law controls a piece of land the lender might accept as a workaround? I sat with that for a minute. A man doesn't wire a building for 40 years without learning to sit still while a fact settles into its proper place. Chase wasn't just mocking my pension at that table, he was measuring my land. He'd already priced it out in his head. The $90,000 under my own shop. Collateral for a debt he hadn't told my daughter the full size of. I asked Marjorie the number. She said she'd only heard rumour. But rumour in Anders Junction is usually short on the number and long on the truth of it. 4 months behind on the equipment note. 60 days, maybe less, before the lender moved to seize the tanks and the cooler. I want to be plain about something here. A man in my position could get a wrong idea about himself. I did not feel triumph sitting in that office. I felt the same thing I feel when I find a short in an old panel that somebody's been living with for years, telling themselves the flickering light is nothing. Relief, mixed with something closer to grief. A live wire in a wall doesn't care whose wall it is. Neither does the truth. I asked Marjorie one more thing before I left. I asked her to have the folder ready to bring to the house herself in 3 weeks at the next Sunday dinner. Not before. I wanted to watch the family a little longer first. A man doesn't cut into a wall until he's traced every wire behind it. She agreed. The way she always agrees when I've made up my mind. She didn't argue. She just wrote the date down. I drove home the long way, past the old Voss electrical shop on Depot Street. Ivan was out front, loading spools of cable into his truck. Same as he's done 6 days a week, for going on 30 years. He waved me down. Ivan Koch started with me when he was 19. Same age I was when I started this whole thing. I taught him to read a panel the way I was taught. He learned faster than I did, which I've always been proud to admit. He runs the shop clean now, doesn't cut corners, pays his note on the 1st of every month like it's a religious observance. He asked how the family dinner went. I told him fine. He didn't push. Ivan's the kind of man who knows when a door's shut, even if he can smell smoke behind it. Then, standing there with a spool of 10 gauge in his hands, he told me something I hadn't asked for. Said Chase had been in the shop last month, out of nowhere, asking questions about the note. Asking if it was the kind of thing that could be refinanced or bought out early. Asking real casual, what would happen to the building's ownership if something happened to me. I asked Ivan what he told him. Told him the truth, Ivan said. Told him it wasn't his business. Told him it wasn't mine to explain either. Since I only pay the note, I don't hold the paper on it. I thanked him. I didn't tell him about the trust. Not yet. He'll hear it soon enough. The same day everybody else does. That's the day I decided the whole thing would come out at once, in one room, so nobody could quietly work an angle on half the truth before the other half arrived. Driving home, I thought about Doreen a long while, about the year before she died, when she'd sit at the kitchen table doing the books by hand, even after I told her the computer program could do it faster. She liked the paper. She liked seeing the numbers in her own hand, she said. Numbers on a screen can lie to you quiet. Numbers in your own handwriting, you have to own every one of them. I went home and got out her old ledger, the one she kept the company books in for 20 years before she got too tired to keep at it. I don't open it often. It still smells faintly like her hand cream. Lavender. Cheap. The same bottle for 30 years because she never saw the sense in switching once something worked. On the second to last page, in her handwriting, in blue ink gone a little grey with age, there was a note I'd read before but never really looked at. It said, W. If the day ever comes they call it beer money, hand them the folder. Let them count it themselves. D. She'd written that 4 years before she died, before Chase ever said a word about a pension, before I ever moved $1 into a trust. She saw something in that man from the very first Thanksgiving. Paige brought him home, something about the way he looked at the house, at the shop, like a man pricing out a job he hadn't been hired for yet. I sat at my own kitchen table a long time with that ledger open. I did not cry. I don't. Not anymore, not where anyone can see. But I'll tell you the metronome on the mantel ticked 6 o'clock while I sat there. I let it run the whole hour, instead of winding it down like I usually do at past. The next morning I drove out to the shop on Depot Street myself. First time in almost a year I'd gone out there just to stand in it. Ivan had the lights on already, 6:15, same as I used to keep them. I walked the floor. I touched the old workbench where I trained 11 apprentices to strip a wire clean without nicking the copper. I opened the breaker panel in the back office, the one I installed with my own hands in 1979. I checked it, out of habit, the way another man might check his own pulse. It was solid, every connection tight. 46 years old and still doing exactly what I built it to do. I thought, standing there, that a man's whole life is a kind of wiring. You run it clean. You label every circuit. You leave it so the next person who opens the panel can see exactly what feeds what. Then somebody comes along who never wired anything in his life and tells you it's beer money. I locked up the shop, told Ivan I'd see him Sunday at dinner. That surprised him some. I don't usually get invited the same weeks Chase does the inviting. I didn't explain, I just said, be there, Ivan. Bring nothing. Just yourself. He said he would. He always does what he says he will. That's worth more to me than any $610,000 note, though I'll admit the note helps. 3 weeks. That's what I gave myself. And what I gave Chase. Though he didn't know he was on a clock. 3 weeks to watch. 3 weeks to let a nervous man dig himself a little deeper without my help. 3 weeks to make sure Marjorie had every page of that folder in perfect order before she carried it, quiet as a lunch pail, into my daughter's dining room. I should tell you a little more about Doreen. A man can't understand the rest of this story without understanding her first. She grew up in Anders Junction, one of 5 kids. Her father a mechanic at the rail yard, her mother a seamstress who took in work from half the county. Doreen never had much growing up, but she had a way of making a little go a long way. The same way she made a can of green beans taste like something worth remembering. The same way she made $1 stretch further than most people manage with 5. I met her at a church supper in 1973. I was 22. I had exactly nothing to my name but a strong back and a willingness to learn a trade nobody else in my family had ever tried. She was working the dessert table that night. She told me later, years after, why she picked me out across the room. I was the only man there who'd offered to help carry the folding chairs back to the storage closet, without being asked twice. We married 2 years later in 1975. The same year, I bought that panel van with the $180 of tools inside it. She never once complained about the years we scraped by on almost nothing. She took a job at the Rusty Cleat the second year we were married. She kept that job for 30 straight years. Long after, we didn't strictly need the money anymore. She said a person ought to keep working with their hands, even once they can afford not to, or something in them starts to go soft that's harder to fix than any wiring. She kept the company's books from the very first year, sitting at our kitchen table most nights, after her shift at the Crab Shack. going over every invoice, every receipt, every dollar in and out, by hand. In a ledger she bought herself for $1.75 at the Five and Dime in town. She never trusted a number she hadn't written down herself. I've come to believe over the years since that this habit of hers is the single reason this whole family still has anything left to argue over today. That insistence on writing every figure down in her own hand. She raised Paige mostly on her own those early years. I was out running wire 6 days a week, sometimes 7, building the business one job at a time. She never resented that either. Or if she did, she never let it curdle into something bitter. She used to tell Paige, when Paige was small, that her daddy was out building something for both of them. She'd say someday Paige would understand what patience actually bought a person, if she paid attention long enough to see it through. I think about that a lot now. Watching my daughter finally, slowly, start to understand exactly what her mother meant. Doreen got sick 8 years ago. Slow at first. The kind of sick that lets you pretend for a while it isn't what it turns out to be. She fought it 4 years, harder than I've ever seen anyone fight anything. She kept the books until the last year she was able. She handed the ledger over to me finally, only when her hands got too unsteady to trust her own writing anymore. I buried her 3 years ago this coming spring, at Fairhaven Cemetery. Under a headstone I picked out myself. Plain granite. Her name and the dates. One line underneath that I chose because it was the truest thing I could think to put there. It reads, "She kept every column honest. I visit most weeks. I don't always talk out loud when I'm there, but I did the week before that dinner. I've told you already what I said to her that day. I told her Sunday was the day. I told her I was doing it the way she'd have wanted. I want you to understand something. Hearing the rest of this story, everything I did in those 3 weeks, I did the way I imagined she'd have wanted it done. Every phone call to Marjorie, every quiet drive past the shop, every figure I laid out on that workbench with Ivan. Patient. Exact. No wasted motion. No cruelty for its own sake. Just the truth. Laid out plain. The way she taught me a column of numbers ought to be laid out. So anybody looking at it later could see exactly what happened. And exactly why. The second week of my 3, Marjorie called me herself. She doesn't often do that. Usually I'm the one climbing those stairs. This time she said, "Come in today, Wendell. Don't wait for Thursday." I drove in that afternoon. She had a different folder out this time. Thinner. She didn't slide it across the desk right away. She just looked at me a second. The way a man looks at a beam before he tells you it won't hold the load you're planning to put on it. 5 weeks ago, she said, somebody filed a petition with the county court. A guardianship petition. Your name on it, Wendell. I want to tell you honest. I felt that one in my chest before I felt it anywhere else. Not fear, something colder. The particular kind of quiet that comes over a man right before he does the most careful work of his life. I asked her who filed it. Paige, she said, my own daughter, petitioning to be named my legal guardian, authority over my finances, my property, my medical decisions, supported by a letter from a doctor in Anders Junction named Felt. Marjorie had already confirmed he'd never once examined me, never taken my blood pressure, never so much as shaken my hand. I sat with that. I thought about every soft word Paige has said to me across that dinner table over the past year. Dad, you don't need to keep going out to the shop at your age. Dad, maybe it's time to think about slowing down. Dad, we just worry about you out there alone. I'd taken every one of those for love. Maybe some of it was. I've decided since that a person can love you and still be talked into betraying you. The way water can be perfectly clean and still carry something that'll make you sick if somebody upstream poured the wrong thing into it. Marjorie told me the petition hadn't gone anywhere yet. No hearing scheduled. Filed quietly, sitting in the clerk's office. The kind of thing a family lets sit until they need it fast. The way you keep a spare key hidden somewhere you hope you never have to use it. I asked her the obvious question. Why now? Why 5 weeks ago? She'd already done the arithmetic before I walked in. That's why I keep her on retainer. 5 weeks ago was 3 weeks before the equipment lender's first formal notice to Chase's business partner. Somebody, likely Chase, had already known the 60-day clock was coming before it ever started ticking and writing. He'd gone looking for a faster way to get his hands on something solid before the bank got there first. If Paige became my guardian, she said, and if a court found in her favour, even provisionally, She'd have standing to challenge or unwind any transfer I'd made in the years before the petition. On the theory I hadn't been competent to make it. That's the play, Wendell. Not the money you have now. The money you already gave away, in their eyes, 3 years ago. I understood then what Chase had really been doing in my shop last month, asking Ivan those quiet questions about the note and the building's ownership. He wasn't asking out of curiosity. He was checking whether the guardianship, once granted, would even have anything left to reach. I told Marjorie the trust would hold regardless. She agreed, mostly. Said a well-drafted, revocable trust, executed while a person is plainly competent, with a lawyer's contemporaneous notes to prove it, is about as close to airtight as this profession gets. But she also said something I've turned over in my mind since. She said, airtight doesn't mean free, Wendell. Even a losing petition cost you a hearing, cost you sitting in a courtroom while your own daughter's lawyer stands up and calls you confused in front of a judge. Oh, some things, even when you win them, you don't walk away whole. I asked her to pull my full medical file, going back 5 years. Every doctor I'd actually seen, every blood test, every clean bill of health. Have it ready. Not to fight yet, just to have it. The way a man keeps a fire extinguisher he hopes he never uses. Checked and current, hanging exactly where he can reach it. I drove home a different way that day, past the county courthouse in Anders Junction. Slow. I looked at it the way you look at a building you never expected to have business inside. That Sunday, the third of my 3 weeks, there was another dinner. Paige had invited me herself, called ahead, said she was making the pork loin, Doreen's recipe, like she was trying to remind me of something warm before whatever was coming came. I want to tell you about that dinner. It's the one where I finally let myself say something, though not the thing I was really thinking. Chase was in a good mood. Bad businessmen usually are, right up until the day the bank calls. He'd had 2 beers before the meal even started. He made a joke, lighter than the toast 3 weeks before, but cut from the same cloth. Some men build empires, and some men just build enough to retire comfortable on beer money. He laughed at his own joke, the way a man laughs when he's decided the world already agrees with him. I set my fork down. I looked at him plain. No heat in it. I said, Chase, you ever price out what $180 of tools turns into in 51 years, compounded by not spending what you don't have? He laughed again, said something about old-timer math. But I watched his eyes when I said it. There's a look a man gets when a stranger accidentally walks toward the exact thing he's been hiding. A flicker. Quick, like a breaker arcing right before it trips. I've seen that look in 1,000 panels. I saw it on Chase's face for less than a second before he covered it with another joke. Paige still wouldn't look at me. But partway through dinner, when Chase got up to get another beer, she leaned over. Quiet. Just for me. Dad, are you doing all right? Financially, I mean. You'd tell us if you weren't, right? I want you to sit with that question a second the way I had to. My own daughter, 5 weeks after filing a petition to take my finances out of my hands, asking me, straight to my face, whether I needed help managing them. I told her I was fine, Paige. Better than fine. I've always been careful. She nodded. For just a second, 1 second, I saw something in her face that wasn't Chase's daughter. Wasn't the woman who'd let a stranger sign a false letter about her own father. I saw the little girl who used to correct her second-grade teacher. Polite about it, but never afraid of a true fact. I think some part of her already knew what she'd done was wrong. I think she was looking for a door back before the door closed. I decided right there, over her mother's pork loin recipe, that I'd leave that door open a crack. For her. Only her. No matter what happened to the rest of that table. After dinner, walking to my truck, Ivan Koch called me. Said Chase had come by the shop again that afternoon. Alone. Asking straight out this time whether Ivan would consider an early buyout of the note. Cash? Discounted? No lawyers involved? Quiet between the two of them. I asked Ivan what he said. Told him no, Wendell, Ivan said. Told him the note's not mine to sell early. Told him if he wants to talk about the building or the land, he needs to talk to you. Told him I doubt you're in a selling mood. I told Ivan he read that exactly right. I drove home that night past the shop again, dark this time. I sat in my truck outside it a long while. I thought about the trust folder sitting in Marjorie's office I thought about the doctor named Felt who'd signed a letter about a man he'd never met. I thought about my daughter's question at the table. Are you doing all right? The small flickering hope underneath it that maybe I was. Maybe she still had a way to make this right before it went any further. I called Marjorie from the truck, told her it was time to move the date up. Not next Sunday. This coming one. 4 days. She asked if I was certain. I told her the same thing I'd told her before. I don't call unless I'm certain. What I didn't say out loud, sitting there in the dark, outside a building I built with my own hands 51 years ago, was that I'd finally understood the whole shape of it. Chase wasn't circling my land because he was greedy in some simple way. He was circling it because he was drowning. Drowning men grab whatever's nearest, even if it's the hand of the one person who'd once have thrown him a rope for free, if he'd only asked plain instead of reaching for it in the dark. I decided that Sunday, 4 days out, would be the day Marjorie brought the folder. I decided Ivan would be there too, sitting beside me, the way he'd always stood beside me in every job that mattered. And I decided, driving home under a sky gone the colour of scorched insulation, that I would not raise my voice once, not even at the end. Doreen never had to raise hers to be the loudest, truest thing in any room she ever stood in. I intended to finish this the same way she'd have finished it herself. 4 days is not a long time to prepare for the end of a con, but it's plenty of time if you've spent 51 years learning to move deliberate. Monday morning I drove to the county recorder's office myself. First time in 3 years, I'd gone in person instead of trusting Marjorie to handle the paperwork. I wanted to see the trust document filed there with my own eyes. Wanted to touch the page. A man who built his living off blueprints doesn't trust a fact until he's held the paper it's printed on. The clerk, a woman named Ardis Kellerman, has stamped half my paperwork for 20 years. She pulled the file without me even finishing the request. She's the kind of clerk who remembers a name the way I remember a wire colour. She told me everything was recorded clean, dated 3 years back. No liens, no challenges, no notices of any kind filed against it since. I asked her, careful, whether anyone else had come in recently asking about that same parcel. She checked. The way a good clerk checks. Thorough. Unhurried. Said yes. A man named Chase Merrick had requested a copy of the deed on the Depot Street property 6 weeks back. Public record, she said. Anybody can ask. But she remembered him asking a second question too. Whether a deed held in trust could be challenged if the trust's creator was later found, in her words, not of sound mind at the time he signed it. I thanked her. I didn't let my face do anything different than it usually does. But 6 weeks back lines up close enough to 5 weeks back, the guardianship filing. I understood then that Chase had been building this whole approach in stages, testing each door before he tried the handle. Tuesday I spent the whole day out at the shop with Ivan. Not working, just sitting in the back office with the ledgers spread across the workbench. I wanted every figure lined up clean before Sunday. Some men prepare for a hard conversation by rehearsing what they'll say. I prepare by making sure every number I might need is one I can produce inside 30 seconds. The moment you have to go looking for a figure in front of the people you're presenting it to, you've already lost half your authority in that room. Here is what I laid out on that workbench. In Doreen's own ledger style. The way she taught me to keep a column honest. $610,000, the face value of Ivan's note. $240,000, the shop building's appraised value. $90,000, the land. 51 years of labour behind all of it, starting with $180 of second-hand tools. $4,100 a month coming in, clean. On the first, same as it's come in for 4 years running. Against that, what I'd since confirmed, through Marjorie's contacts and Ivan's own careful listening around town, $170,000 borrowed against Chase and Page's house for the brewery expansion. 4 months behind on that note. At a rough guess, the arrears sat somewhere near $11,000, penalties climbing every week, a 60-day notice already issued. By my count, Chase had less than 3 weeks left before the lender's crew showed up to haul the tanks and the walk-in cooler out of Merrick Brewhouse for good. A doctor's letter, paid for, though I never did learn the exact figure Felt charged for signing his name to a lie. A guardianship petition filed in the county court, 5 weeks old, quiet, waiting. And under all of it, unmoved the entire time, a trust that had held every asset clean for 3 years, waiting on nothing but the day I decided to open the folder myself. I want to say something plain here about what that word, confused, did to me when I finally let myself feel it, instead of just filing it away. Confused. As if the 51 years I spent reading a blueprint before I ever picked up a tool had somehow worn thin enough that I couldn't read my own bank statement. As if a man who can still find a dead short by the smell of it alone had gone soft in the one place that mattered most to the people circling him. I let that word sit in me a long minute out at that shop. Tuesday afternoon, the light coming low through the same windows I'd installed in 1979. Then I put it down. The way you put down a tool that's done its job. I got back to the ledger. Wednesday, I drove out to Fairhaven Cemetery, which I do most weeks, but this time I brought something with me. Doreen's old ledger, the one with her note on the second to last page. I sat on the bench near her stone a long while and read that note over again. If the day ever comes they call it beer money, hand them the folder. Let them count it themselves. I talked to her a little, out loud, the way I do out there when nobody's around to think it strange. Told her Sunday was the day. Told her I was doing it the way she'd have wanted. Quiet. No raised voices. Just the truth laid flat on a table where everybody could see it plain. I want to tell you about the toolbox because it matters to how Sunday went. I've got an old scuffed steel toolbox that used to ride in the bed of every truck I've owned since 1974. For 2 weeks before that Sunday, it sat locked in the bed of my current truck. If anyone in that family had thought to ask what an old electrician was hauling around in a toolbox he never opened at any job site, I'd have told them the truth. There was no job left in it anymore. Marjorie had helped me pack it herself, the Tuesday before. Every notarized page of the trust. The recorder's certified copy of the deed. My full medical file, 5 years clean. Every test, signed and dated. And wrapped in a plastic sleeve to keep it from the damp, Doreen's ledger itself, open to that second to last page. I carried that toolbox with me everywhere those 2 weeks. Into the truck, out of the truck, into the house at night and back out in the morning. The way you carry a weapon you sincerely hope you never have to draw, but wouldn't dream of leaving unloaded in a drawer somewhere. Thursday, 2 days before, Paige called me. Not about the dinner, about nothing in particular. The kind of call a daughter makes when she wants to hear her father's voice sound normal. Wants some proof the ground under both of them is still where she left it. She asked how I was doing. I told her fine, same as always. She asked offhand, almost too casual, whether I'd been keeping up with things. My finances, my paperwork, whether I had somebody helping me with all that these days. I told her the truth, careful. I told her I've always kept my own books page, same as your mother did, in my own hand, so I never have to wonder whose numbers I'm looking at. She went quiet on the line a second. Then she said something I didn't expect. She said, "Dad, I don't want anything bad to happen to you. I just want to make sure you're protected." I believed her. That's the strange truth of it. I believe to this day that some real, honest fear for my welfare got twisted up inside her alongside whatever Chase had been feeding her for months. Twisted so tight she couldn't tell anymore which thread was love and which was fear of the bank calling her own husband's loan. I told her, gentle as I could manage, that I was more protected than she knew. I told her she'd understand what I meant soon enough. She didn't push. I think some part of her was afraid to. Friday, the day before I drove the toolbox to Marjorie's office myself, left it with her, so she could bring both folders, mine and hers, together Sunday afternoon. She asked me one more time, standing at the top of those creaking stairs, whether I wanted to soften any of it. Ease into the news instead of laying it all out at once. I told her no. I told her I'd spent 51 years running wire clean and labelled so the next man could read it plain. I wasn't about to start hiding the truth behind a curtain now. Not for people who tried to hide theirs behind mine. She nodded, the way she does when she's already decided I'm right, and just wanted to give me one last chance to change my mind. Then she said, "See you Sunday, Wendell." 4 o'clock, I'll bring the folder. I drove home Friday evening past the shop one more time. Lights already off. Ivan gone home for the weekend. I sat in my truck a minute in the dark lot, same as I had the week before. I thought about all 51 years of it. The panel van, the $180, the switch house I wired twice, the 11 apprentices, the wife who kept every column honest at a kitchen table until the year she couldn't anymore. I thought about a man 41 years old, drowning quiet in a debt he'd hidden from the one person who loved him best. reaching for a rope woven out of my own name instead of just asking for help, like a man who'd built something himself would have known how to do. I thought, sitting there, that I still had one door open for my daughter, one crack of light I intended to leave, lit no matter what happened Sunday to the rest of that table. And everybody else at that table, Chase most of all, was about to learn something. The difference between a joke about beer money and the actual cost of everything he'd spent his life pretending he already owned. Sunday was 2 days off. I went home, wound the metronome up a little early that Friday night, let it tick past its usual half hour. I sat in my kitchen a long while listening to it, the way another man might sit up, listening for a storm he already knows is coming. Calm about it. He built the roof himself. He trusts every nail in it. Saturday, the day before the dinner, I drove out to Anders Junction on an errand. I hadn't told Marjorie about it. I hadn't told Ivan either. I wanted to see Merrick Brewhouse with my own eyes. One time, before I sat across a table from the man who ran it, I'd never actually been inside it. Paige had invited me twice over the 2 years since it expanded. I'd found reasons both times not to go. Not out of spite, just because a tap room full of strangers drinking on a Friday night isn't a place a 70-year-old widower finds much comfort in. But I wanted to see it now, for reasons I understood clearly enough, even if I couldn't have explained them to anybody at that table. It sat on a corner lot, 2 blocks off the Anders Junction Square. Brick front, big windows. A hand-painted sign that must have cost somebody a few $1,000s to get right. I parked across the street. I sat in my truck a long while, just looking at it. The way I used to sit and look at a job site before I ever picked up a tool, reading the whole shape of a problem before I touched a single wire. Through the big windows I could see the new tanks Ivan had mentioned. 4 of them. Tall steel cylinders lined up along the back wall, gleaming under work lights even on a slow Saturday afternoon. I know steel. I know what a tank like that costs new. I know what it costs to finance one on a personal guarantee when your business doesn't yet have the cash flow to carry it clean. Those 4 tanks were sitting there, worth every bit of that $170,000 Marjorie had mentioned. None of it paid for yet. Not really. Not in any way that would survive a hard look from a bank. A man came out the side door while I sat there, younger than Chase, an apron still on. I recognised him after a second as Chase's business partner, a fellow named Boyd Wickstrom. He wouldn't have known my face from any other retired man parked across the street. He lit a cigarette, looked at his phone a long minute. I watched something in his shoulders that I recognised from watching men open a breaker panel they already suspect has been arcing quietly behind the wall for months. That particular kind of tired. The kind that comes from carrying bad news a while before anybody makes you say it out loud. I didn't go in. I didn't need to. I'd seen enough. 4 tanks. A partner smoking alone in a parking lot on a Saturday afternoon. A business that called itself steady to anyone who asked. I drove home with the whole shape of it settled clean in my mind. The way a good diagram settles once you've traced every wire back to its source. That evening I called Marjorie one last time before Sunday. Asked her to confirm one more figure for me. The arrears total. Exact. If she could get it. She called back within the hour. $11,400 behind, as of that week. Climbing at a penalty rate of just under 2% a month, on top of the missed payments themselves. The lender's 60-day notice had 17 days left to run. 17 days. I sat with that number a long while. 17 days before 4 steel tanks and a walk-in cooler got hauled out of a building my own daughter's family had bet their house on, whether the guardianship petition succeeded or not. I want to tell you something about how I spent that last night before the dinner. It matters to understanding the man who walked into that dining room the next afternoon. I didn't spend it angry. I spent most of it at my kitchen table. Doreen's ledger open in front of me, going back through old entries from years before any of this. Back when Chase and Paige had first started dating. Back when I'd written her a check for $800 toward her first car. Back when Doreen had noted in her own hand a birthday gift of $400 for Paige's 25th. Beside it, in different ink, added later, a small note. It just said, "Good girl, works hard, deserves it." I thought about all the plain, honest money that had passed through this family over 40 years. Gifts given freely, out of love, never once resented, never once tracked like a debt owed. And I thought about how different this coming Sunday was going to feel. Money laid out not as a gift this time, but as evidence. Somebody in this family had decided love could be measured, priced, and eventually taken by force if it wasn't given up willingly. I thought about what it would do to Paige to hear all of it at once. I sat there past midnight, the metronome long since wound down and silent on the mantel. I decided I would give her every chance that dinner, every chance to find her own way back to the truth before I laid the whole folder down. I decided Chase would get no such patience. A man who marries into a family and then quietly measures its land for collateral has forfeited any claim to being handled gentle. I went to bed late that Saturday night and slept better than I expected to. I dreamed, for the first time in longer than I could remember, about the panel van, the one I bought Voss Electrical's very first tools out of. 51 years back. $180 spent on a skill saw, a hand drill, a coil of wire nobody else wanted. In the dream, Doreen was there too, younger than I ever really knew her, standing beside that van with her arms crossed, telling me the colour of the boat hull she'd decided on before I'd even finished the frame. I woke up Sunday morning with that dream still sitting warm in my chest. I understood, lying there in the grey early light, that whatever happened at that table later that afternoon, I wasn't doing it out of anger at Chase. Not really. I was doing it because a woman who'd stood beside me for 30 years had asked me, plain, to protect what we'd built together. I had exactly one afternoon left to keep that promise the way she'd have wanted it kept. Quiet, complete, and true. I want to back up a little. There's a piece of that middle week I haven't told you yet. It matters more than it seemed to at the time. The Wednesday after Marjorie first told me about the guardianship petition, I drove out to see an old friend of mine, a man named Otto Prine, the same farmer who'd watched me fix Delmar's breaker panel at the grain bin a few weeks before. Otto's farmed the same 400 acres outside Redbud Crossing his whole life. He knows everybody's business in this county, the way I know wiring, thoroughly, without ever needing to ask twice. I found him in his equipment shed, working on a baler that had thrown a belt. I helped him get it running again the way I've helped him get a dozen things running over 40 years of neighbouring each other. While we worked, I asked him, careful, whether he'd heard anything around town about Merrick Brewhouse. Otto didn't even look up from the belt. Said the whole county knew Chase Merrick was in over his head out there. Said his own brother-in-law had turned down a chance to invest in the expansion 2 years back, on account of the numbers never sitting right to him, too much borrowed. Not enough coming in the door on a Tuesday night in a town the size of Anders Junction. I asked him if he'd heard anything about a doctor named Felt. Otto straightened up at that, wiped his hands on a rag, said, "That quack? Man signs anything for anybody willing to pay the fee. Half the county's heard that about him one way or another. Surprised he's still got a licence, honestly." I thanked Otto and drove home with that confirmation sitting heavy in my chest. It's one thing to hear a fact from a lawyer, laid out clean and careful in an office. It's another thing entirely to hear the same fact from a farmer in an equipment shed. Unprompted. Plain. The way the truth sounds when it hasn't been dressed up for anybody's benefit. That same week I stopped by Ardis Kellerman's window at the recorder's office again, just to ask her, friendly, whether she remembered exactly what Chase had asked when he came in about the deed. She pulled her memory back careful, the way a good clerk does. Told me he'd specifically asked about a challenge process. How a family member could contest a trust if they believed the person who created it hadn't been, in her words again, of sound mind at the time. I asked her when exactly. She checked her log. 6 weeks back, same as she'd told me before, but this time she added something new. Said he'd come back a second time, 10 days later, and asked a different question. Asked whether a successor trustee, once a trust reverted to them, could be removed by a court if new evidence surfaced about the original trustee's competency. I sat with that a long minute in my truck outside the recorder's office. Chase hadn't just been circling the trust itself, he'd been circling Ivan too, thinking 2 steps ahead, wondering whether even the fallback protection I'd built around Ivan could eventually be pried loose if the guardianship stuck. I drove straight to the shop after that and told Ivan everything. For the first time, the whole shape of it. The trust, the note, the land, the guardianship petition. Chase's questions to Ardis about removing a successor trustee. Ivan didn't say much at first. He set down the wire stripper he'd been holding and just stood there a minute, the way a man stands when he's absorbing something too large to respond to right away. Then he said, "Wendell, I've paid that note faithful for 4 years because I gave you my word I would, because you taught me everything I know about doing a job honest. I'll fight for that trust in court myself if it ever comes to that. Same as I'd fight for anything else you built. I told him it likely wouldn't come to that, not with the paperwork Marjorie had waiting. But I wanted him to know, plain, what he was standing next to. A man deserves to know the size of a fire before he's asked to stand near it. I thought a lot that week about the word family, what it actually means once you've lived long enough to watch it get used as a weapon. Chase had called it family business, that first dinner and everyone after, as though the word itself was supposed to soften whatever he was doing underneath it. But family, real family, the kind Doreen and I built over 30 years, was never about who could extract the most from who. It was about who showed up at 6 in the morning without being asked, the way Ivan had shown up at that shop 6 days a week for 3 decades. The way Otto Prine had helped me 100 times and never once mentioned owing. I decided driving home that Wednesday evening that whatever happened at the Sunday dinner, I would say that word, family, back to Chase. At least once. Mean something entirely different by it than he ever had. The days between that Wednesday and the following Sunday moved slow. The way the last week before a big pour always moves slow. Everything prepped, everything measured. Nothing left to do but wait for the concrete truck and trust the forms you built would hold once the weight came down on them. I kept working those last days. Small jobs, nothing that mattered much. Fixing a neighbour's porch light, checking a breaker for a widow 2 streets over who'd known Doreen from church. I did it because staying idle those final days would have let the waiting eat at me. A man who's spent his whole life with his hands busy doesn't know how to sit still gracefully, not even when the biggest job of his life is the one he can't start yet. Friday night, the night before the dinner, I sat a long while on my own porch, looking out at the street I'd lived on for 40 years, thinking about every choice that had led to this one. The panel van, the $180, Doreen's hands steady on a ledger for 2 decades, the apprentices I'd trained, the buildings I'd wired, the daughter I'd raised who now sat 16 miles away, married to a man circling everything her parents ever built, like water circles a drain, looking for the lowest point to pour into. I thought, sitting there, that I'd spent 51 years making sure every circuit I ever wired was clearly labelled. So the next man who opened that panel would know exactly what fed what. Never have to guess in the dark. I decided that was exactly what I intended to do at that dinner table. Not punish, not humiliate, not more than the truth itself was bound to humiliate on its own. Just label everything, clean and plain, so nobody in that room would ever again have to guess in the dark about where the money came from or who it had always truly belonged to. Sunday came in clear and a little cold for the season, the kind of sky you get in northeastern Missouri in early fall. No clouds, just a hard blue overhead, like somebody had wiped the whole thing down with a rag. I dressed plain, same as I always do. Work boots, clean jeans, a collared shirt Doreen used to iron for me on Sundays before I learned to do it myself. Badly, but well enough. I looked in the mirror a long minute before I left the house. I told the man looking back at me the same thing I've told him before every hard job of my life. Read the panel before you touch the panel. Know exactly what you're about to open before you open it. I drove to Ivan's place first, picked him up. I decided he ought not to arrive alone. Ivan Koch has earned the right to sit beside me at any table I ever sit at again. He came out to the truck in a clean flannel shirt, said, "You sure about this, Wendell?" I told him I was sure about very little in this life anymore, but I was sure about this. We drove to Paige's house together, Ivan and I. The toolbox rode quiet on the floor of the back seat, though the toolbox stayed empty that day. Everything real rode instead in Marjorie's briefcase. She'd bring it separately. Time to arrive 20 minutes after the meal started same as we'd planned. Paige's house sits on a rise outside Redbud Crossing. A nice house. 4 bedrooms. The kind of house a floor plan of good debt buys a young family in a small town. Chase's truck was already in the driveway. Newer than mine by 20 years. Worth 1/10 of what mine's worth once you count what's under it instead of what's painted on it. Paige met us at the door. She looked surprised to see Ivan. I watched something flicker across her face. Quick, the same kind of flicker I'd seen cross Chase's face at that last dinner. A man or woman sensing a wire's gone live somewhere in a wall they thought was dead. "Come in, Dad," she said. She hugged me longer than usual. I let her. Whatever was coming, I wasn't going to be the one who made that hug shorter than it needed to be. Inside, the table was already half set. Pork loin smell coming out of the kitchen. Doreen's recipe again. I thought, not for the first time, that my daughter cooks her mother's food the way some people say a prayer. Out of old habit more than belief. Hoping the ritual still carries some of the original meaning, even after the person who taught it to you is gone. Chase came out of the den with a beer already in his hand. 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He greeted me the way he always does. Loud. Easy. A hand on my shoulder like we were old friends instead of a drowning man, and the rope he'd been quietly measuring for weeks. "Wendell," he said. "Ivan. Didn't know we'd have the whole crew today." I told him Ivan's been part of this family longer than some folks who married into it. I said it plain. No edge on it, just a fact laid down flat. Chase laughed. The way he laughs at things that land a little too close. Said something about how that's true. True, old Ivan's practically a Voss himself at this point. I want to tell you what I was thinking underneath my own calm face. Right then, that's the part the people in that room never got to hear. I was thinking, you have no idea, Chase, how much more of a Voss he is than you'll ever be. Ivan Koch has never once in 30 years asked me for anything he hadn't already earned with his own 2 hands. We sat down to eat around 4:15. Paige had made the pork loin, mashed potatoes, green beans from her own garden. The kind of meal that would have made Doreen proud if Doreen had been there to see it. Some part of me ached at that, sitting at a table set with her recipe, while her own granddaughter's father circled what was left of the life she'd helped me build. Chase talked most of the meal, the way he usually does. Told a story about the brewery's full lineup, a pumpkin ale he was proud of. Said business was steady. I noted that. Quiet. A man 4 months behind on a loan does not describe his business as steady. He describes it exactly that carefully, because he's rehearsed the word in advance. Around 4:30, my phone buzzed once in my pocket. I didn't look at it in front of them. I knew what it was. Marjorie letting me know she was 5 minutes out, same as we'd planned. I want to describe what it felt like, sitting at that table in those last 5 minutes. It's the part of the whole 3 weeks I remember most clear. Chase telling his pumpkin ale story, easy and loud. A man who believed with his whole chest that nothing in this world was about to change for him. Paige refilling water glasses. Quiet. Still not quite meeting my eyes, but closer to it than she'd been at the last 2 dinners. Like some instinct in her had already started bracing for weather she couldn't name yet. Ivan across from me, calm as a held breath. The same look on his face I'd seen on him 1,000 times, right before he closed up a panel he knew was going to hold. And me, sitting at the head of that table where Chase always makes sure I'm not seated, off to the side instead. In the same spot I'd sat in 3 weeks earlier when he raised a glass and called my whole life beer money. I thought about that toast a whole 5 minutes. I thought about the word confused. I thought about a guardianship petition, sitting quiet in a courthouse file, filed by my own daughter's hand, resting on a lie a paid doctor put his name to. I did not feel anger sitting there. I want to be honest about that. Anger would have been easy, and it wouldn't have been true. What I felt was closer to the stillness right before you throw a breaker. That last half second where you already know the circuit's about to come alive. Nothing left to do but flip the switch and trust the work you did beforehand. The doorbell rang at 4:36. Paige got up to answer it, said something about maybe a neighbour. I watched Chase's face when she came back into the dining room with Marjorie Doss behind her, briefcase in hand, calm as a woman delivering nothing more than a casserole dish. Chase's easy smile didn't leave his face right away. It just went a little stiff at the edges. The way a smile goes when a man's mind is racing 3 steps ahead of his mouth, trying to work out why his father-in-law's lawyer is standing in his dining room on a Sunday afternoon, holding a leather briefcase like it weighs more than it should. "Marjorie," he said, "everything all right?" She smiled at him, polite. The same smile she gives every difficult client right before she tells them something they don't want to hear. "Everything's fine, Chase," she said. "Wendell asked me to stop by. Family business. Won't take long." Paige looked at me then. Really looked. For the first time in 3 weeks. I saw the question in her face before she asked it out loud. "Dad, what's going on?" I set my fork down. I finished the water in my glass, and I said the same thing I'd said to myself in the mirror that morning. though I said it out loud this time. Plain. No heat in it at all. I said, I think it's time everybody at this table found out exactly what beer money bought. Marjorie didn't open her briefcase right away. She stood by the sideboard a moment, calm, waiting on me. We'd agreed beforehand that this part would go at my pace, not hers, not Chase's, not anybody's but mine. I asked her to sit first, told Paige to bring her a plate if there was one to spare. Whatever this dinner turned into, I wasn't going to let it stop being a dinner first. Paige moved like a woman underwater. Slow. Careful. Setting a plate down in front of Marjorie with hands that hadn't stopped shaking since the doorbell rang. Chase found something like his voice again. Wendell, he said. Whatever this is about, I'm sure we can talk it through. Family to family. I looked at him a long moment before I answered. I thought about the word he'd used 3 weeks earlier. Beer money. How easy it had come off his tongue. How certain he'd been that the number attached to it was small enough to laugh at. I said, Chase, I've spent 51 years reading a room before I ever touch a wire in it. I'm going to read this one a little longer before anybody talks anything through. I asked him, plain how the brewery was doing. Not accusing. Just a question. The kind a father-in-law might ask over dinner on any given Sunday. He said fine. Same word he'd used earlier at the table. Fine. Steady. Like he'd rehearsed it enough times that it came out smooth no matter what was actually being asked. I asked him about the new tanks, the ones he'd expanded the taproom to hold 2 years back. Asked how the loan on those was sitting these days. I watched something go still behind his eyes. He said, Why do you ask, Wendell? Like it's any of your business. I told him, calm, that a man who calls another man's pension beer money at his own daughter's table ought to be ready for a few questions about his own finances in return. Out of fairness, if nothing else. Paige looked between the two of us. Dad, she said, what's going on? Why are you asking him about the loan? I asked her instead. I asked her straight. Have you seen the statements yourself, Paige? Have you seen what that loan actually costs every month? Or has Chase always handled that part alone? She didn't answer right away. That silence told me everything her mouth hadn't gotten around to yet. I let a minute pass. Nobody touched their food. The pork loin sat cooling in the centre of the table. Doreen's recipe, made by a daughter who still didn't know yet how much her mother had already seen coming. I asked Chase one more question before I let Marjorie open her case. I asked him whether the equipment lender had sent any letters lately. Formal ones. On letterhead. His jaw worked a second before anything came out. He said, That's a private business matter, Wendell. That's got nothing to do with tonight. I told him I disagreed. I told him it had everything to do with tonight. A man circling another man's land. The way water circles a drain doesn't get to call the questions unfair once somebody finally asks them out loud. Ivan spoke for the first time since we'd sat down. Quiet, the way he always talks, but it landed hard in that room. He said, Chase, you asked me last month if the note on the shop could be bought out early. You asked if the building's ownership would change if something happened to Wendell. I didn't think much of it at the time. I've thought plenty about it since. Chase's face went a shade paler at that. I watched him look at Paige, quick, like a man checking whether his wife had heard something he'd hoped would stay buried in a shop office 16 miles away. Paige turned to him slow. You asked Ivan that, she said. When? He didn't answer. That non-answer was its own kind of answer. I watched it land on my daughter's face, the way a hard fact lands. Unwelcome. Undeniable. The exact way I'd hoped it would land before the folder ever came out. I wanted her to arrive at some of this on her own steam, not just be told it by a lawyer's paperwork. I asked her then, gentle as I could manage it, about the doctor. I asked whether she remembered the name of the man who'd examined me for that letter she'd had drawn up. Her face did something complicated. What letter, Dad? She said. But her voice had already lost its certainty by the third word. I told her plain. I told her about a petition filed in the county courthouse 5 weeks back. Her name on it. Mine attached to it. A letter from a doctor named Felt, included as supporting evidence. I watched my own daughter's face go through every stage of it, realising her husband had used her name, her signature, her love for her father, all of it a tool in a plan she'd only understood half of. I never met a Dr. Felt, she said, quiet, almost to herself. Chase said it was just a formality. In case something happened suddenly, he said it was to protect you. She stopped. She looked at Chase. He looked at his plate. I let that sit a long moment too. I've learned over 51 years of reading rooms that the truth does most of its own work if you just give it enough silence to breathe in. Then I nodded to Marjorie. She reached for the briefcase. Marjorie's hand rested on the clasp of the briefcase, but she didn't lift it yet. I hadn't nodded again. She knew me well enough by now to wait for the second nod, not the first. Chase stood up from the table, not fast, not angry. Not just the slow rise of a man who needs to move because sitting still has become unbearable. He walked to the window, looked out at Paige's garden, the same green beans she'd served us. He stood there a long moment with his back to the room. I want to tell you what I was thinking, watching him stand there. It's a thing I've thought about many times since. I thought about the first Thanksgiving he ever came to our house, 12 years back. Young, a little nervous, asking me polite questions about the shop, about the tools, about how a man builds a business out of a panel van and $180. He'd seemed that first year like a man who wanted to learn something. I remember Doreen liking him fine that first year too, before whatever changed in him changed. He turned back to the table. "Wendell," he said, his voice different now. Quieter, less certain. "You don't understand the position I'm in. The lender's going to take everything if I don't find a way to cover this. Everything Paige and I built. Our house is on that guarantee too, you understand that? Our own house." I told him I understood exactly what position he was in. Better than he thought I did. I'd stood outside his own building the day before and counted his tanks myself. That landed on him harder than anything Marjorie's papers had said so far. "You were there?" he asked. "Yesterday." I told him yes. Told him I'd wanted to see the thing he'd built with his own hands, the way I'd built mine, before I decided how much of my own life's work I was willing to let him borrow against. Paige spoke up then, quiet but steadier than before. "Chase," she said, "how bad is it? Tell me the real number." Not steady. "The real one." He was quiet a long moment. Then he said it. Low, like the number itself cost him something to say out loud. 181,400, all in with the penalties. Due effectively in 17 days. Or they take the tanks and the cooler and call the rest of the note anyway. Paige's hand went to her mouth. I watched her do the arithmetic her own husband hadn't trusted her to do herself for 2 years. She realised the house she was sitting in had been quietly staked against 4 steel tanks, 4 bedrooms, a garden full of green beans, all of it collateral for a business that called itself steady. "You told me we were fine," she said. "Every month for 2 years I asked you, and you told me we were fine. I didn't want you to worry," he said. Even as the words came out of him, I could hear how thin they sounded in that room. How a man says exactly that sentence, right before every betrayal gets its final shape. I let a moment pass, then I asked the question I'd been saving, the one that mattered more to me than any dollar figure in Marjorie's folder. I asked him, plain, whether the guardianship petition had been his idea from the start, or whether Paige had come to it on her own. Neither of them answered right away. Then Paige said, quiet, looking at her husband instead of me, it was his idea. He said if something happened to you suddenly, a stroke, a fall, anything, and there was no guardian named, everything could get frozen in probate for years. The family could lose the shop, lose everything. While lawyers fought over it, he said Dr. Felt was a friend of Boyd's, that it was just a formality, just in case. "Boyd," I said. "Boyd Wickstrom. Your business partner." Chase's face did something complicated at that, some new piece of understanding arriving late. The recognition that I already knew names he hadn't expected me to know at all. I told them then about seeing Boyd outside the brew house, smoking alone in the parking lot. The tired set of his shoulders. I watched Chase understand in real time that his own partner had likely been the one nervous enough to go asking questions around town. Questions that eventually found their way, thread by thread, small town by small town, back to me. I said, "Chase, I want you to understand something plain. I don't think you ever really did. Not once in 12 years. I never once begrudged you $1 of what this family gave you freely. Not the down payment we helped with on this house. Not the wedding. Not the times Doreen slipped Paige cash, before you two even knew we noticed you were struggling some months. All of that was a gift, given because we loved her, and because for a good while I thought we loved you too." He didn't say anything. His jaw worked, but nothing came out. I said, "Here's what I can't forgive, Chase. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. You could have walked into my kitchen and told me straight. Wendell, I'm in trouble. I need help. Instead, you went looking for a way to take what you needed without ever having to ask for it. You used my own daughter's love for me as the tool to do it with. Paige was crying now. Quiet. Steady tears. The kind that come when a person finally sees the full shape of something they had been standing too close to see clearly before. I looked at her. I said the thing I needed her to hear before anything else happened at that table. I told her I understood fear does strange things to good judgment. I told her I still loved her, whole and complete, the same as I had the day she was born. I told her nothing in the folder Marjorie was about to open changed one particle of that. Then I told them both it was time to see exactly what they'd been trying to reach. I looked at Marjorie. Not yet, I told her. 1 more minute. Marjorie kept her hand on the clasp. I asked her, quiet, to wait just 1 more minute. There was a thing I wanted to say to my daughter before any document did the talking for me. I looked at Paige. I said, before Marjorie opens that case, I want you to know something. Your mother loved you the exact same way on the day she died as she did the day you were born. Nothing that happens in the next few minutes changes that. Nothing you've done these last 5 weeks erases 51 years of a family built honest. Paige was still crying. Quiet. She nodded, unable to speak yet. Chase had gone very still by the window, his back half turned. One hand braced on the sill, like a man steadying himself before a fall he could already feel coming. I want to describe the room a moment. I've thought about it many times since. The exact shape of it. The way a man remembers the layout of a job site he worked years ago, without ever meaning to memorize it. The pork loin, cold now, sitting at the center of the table between 2 barely touched plates. The green beans in a white ceramic dish that used to be Doreen's, one of the few things I'd given Paige after the funeral. The window behind Chase, looking out on a garden he hadn't planted, tended by a wife he'd spent 2 years quietly gambling against without ever telling her the stakes. Ivan sat across from me the whole time, steady. The same look on his face I remembered from watching him close up a panel he already knew was sound. He hadn't said much through any of it, but every word he had said had landed exact. The way a good apprentice learns to speak only when the words matter. I thought, sitting there, about the 17 days left on Chase's lender notice. I did some arithmetic of my own. Quiet. The kind I used to do standing in front of a breaker panel, deciding which circuit to kill first. 17 days wasn't a coincidence anymore. Not once I understood the guardianship petition had been sitting in that courthouse for 5 weeks already. Chase had built himself 2 separate clocks, running side by side, betting that whichever one finished first would save him from the other. If the lender moved first, he'd hoped the family's own money, my land, my note, would already be within reach through Paige's guardianship, close enough to refinance against before anyone but the 4 of us at this table ever had to know the shape of it. If the guardianship somehow stalled, he'd hoped the brewery could limp along another few months on whatever thin credit was left to him, buying enough time to try the guardianship again with better paperwork. 2 clocks, both of them, as of this Sunday afternoon, about to stop at once, not in the direction he'd built them to stop in. I said, out loud, some version of that arithmetic. Plain. So the whole table understood I hadn't stumbled onto this by accident, hadn't just gotten lucky piecing together scraps. I told them I'd been watching both clocks for weeks, quiet. The same way I'd wait on a bad connection to finally show itself instead of chasing it blind through a wall. Chase turned from the window then. For the first time all evening, something other than fear moved across his face, something closer to shame, raw and unrehearsed. He said, I never meant for it to go this far, Wendell. I thought I'd find another way before it ever got to a courtroom. I thought the loan would clear before anybody had to use the petition at all. I told him I believed that, actually. I told him most men who end up doing something this ugly don't set out planning the whole shape of it from day one. They take one small step that feels reasonable, then another. Each one makes the last one harder to undo, until one day they're standing in a dining room explaining themselves to a father-in-law who's been watching the whole slow slide the entire time. I said, that doesn't make it right, Chase. It just makes it human. And it still cost my daughter something I don't know if she'll ever get back whole. Paige reached out then. She put her hand flat on the table. Not toward Chase. Not toward me. Just flat on the wood, like she needed something solid to hold on to while the floor kept shifting under her. She said, quiet, I need to hear all of it, Dad. Whatever's in that folder. All of it. Right now. No more waiting. Before Marjorie lifted the first document out, I want to tell you about one more thing that happened in that room. Small. Easy to miss. But it's stayed with me since. Paige got up from her chair, walked around the table, stood behind Ivan for a moment, her hand resting light on his shoulder. She said, "Thank you, Ivan. For everything you didn't say these last few weeks. For everything you did say tonight." Ivan just nodded. The way he does. A man who's never needed many words to mean a great deal by the few he uses. Then Paige sat back down, closer to me this time than she'd sat all evening, close enough that I could reach over and take her hand if she needed it. Though neither of us said anything about that out loud, Chase remained standing by the window. I watched him look for just a moment at the garden outside. The green beans, the little wooden trellis I'd helped him build, the first spring he and Paige moved in. Back when I still believed the two of us were building something together instead of watching one man quietly measure the other for parts. He said low, almost to himself, "I used to think I was good at this. Business. Numbers. I used to think I could see 3 moves ahead of anybody." I told him, not unkindly, that seeing 3 moves ahead means nothing if you never once check whether the board itself is the one you think it is. I told him he'd spent 2 years planning around a piece of land, and a note he never once bothered to actually understand. A man who guesses at a blueprint instead of reading it plain always ends up surprised by what's actually load-bearing. He didn't answer that. There wasn't much left to answer it with. I looked at Marjorie. I told her, "Go ahead now. Read it plain, the way we planned it. Every figure. Every date. Nothing softened. Nothing rushed." She nodded once. The same brisk, professional nod she'd given me 100 times over 13 years of business between us. She reached into the case. Nobody said anything for a second. The kind of silence that has weight to it. Like the hush right after a breaker trips, and every light in a house goes dark at once. Marjorie set her briefcase on the sideboard. Unhurried. Opened it the way she opens every case. Methodical. The way I strip a wire. Clean. No wasted motion. Chase found his voice first. He laughed, but it came out thin this time. Nothing like the laugh from 3 weeks earlier. "Beer money," he said. "Come on, Wendell, it was a joke." I looked at him plain. I said, "I know it was a joke to you, Chase. It wasn't a joke to me. $4,100 a month is not a joke. It's a number. Numbers don't care whether you meant something by them or not." Paige had gone very still in her chair. "Dad," she said, "please, whatever this is, can we just talk? Just us." I told her we were going to talk, Paige. All of us. Together. That's exactly what was about to happen. Marjorie pulled the first document. She didn't raise her voice either. Not once through the whole thing. I've thought about that since. It struck me that the two of us, the tradesman and the lawyer, had built our whole lives on the same principle without ever once discussing it. Read it plain. Let the fact do the work. She said, 3 years ago, Wendell established the Voss Family Trust, placed into it the promissory note from Ivan Koch, currently valued at approximately $540,000 outstanding. The Depot Street shop building, appraised at $240,000. The half-acre parcel beneath it, appraised at $90,000. Wendell is sole trustee. Ivan Koch is named successor trustee. Chase's face did something I want to describe careful. I've turned it over in my mind many times since. It didn't go red, the way an angry man's face goes red. It went the colour of drywall paste, pale and a little grey, the exact colour a wall goes right before you realise the water damage behind it is worse than you thought. "That's not possible," he said. "That building, that note, that's part of the estate. That has to be part of the estate." Marjorie told him, patient, the way she'd explain a fact to anyone who hadn't studied law, that a properly executed revocable trust removes an asset from the probate estate entirely. This one had been recorded at the county recorder's office 3 years prior. Witnessed. Notarized. With a contemporaneous letter from Wendell's physician confirming full competency at the time of signing. I watched Chase do arithmetic behind his eyes. Fast. The way I've watched apprentices do arithmetic when they realise a job's about to run over budget on materials they already ordered. He looked at Paige. Paige looked at her plate. I said, "Since we're laying things on the table today, Chase, I understand your equipment lender sent you a notice a while back. 60 days, I believe. I understand you're about 4 months behind on that note now. Give or take $11,000 in penalties climbing. Every week you don't answer it. The room went quieter than it had been a minute before, if that's possible. Chase's mouth opened. Nothing came out of it right away. How do you, he started, and then he stopped himself. There wasn't a version of that sentence that ended anywhere good for him. I told him plain. I told him I've spent 51 years listening to what a building tells me before it tells anybody else. A shop on Depot Street, a county recorder's office, a clerk named Ardis Kellerman, who remembers every face that ever asked her a question about a piece of land. I told him a small town only feels private to the people who've never bothered learning how loud it actually is. Paige finally looked up. Dad, she said, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. Is this about? And she stopped, like she couldn't finish the sentence either, the same way Chase couldn't. I said it for her, gentle as I could make it land. Some part of me still wanted this next part to reach her clean, not as an attack, as a fact she needed to hear plain. I said, Paige, 5 weeks ago, you filed a petition with the county court, asking to be named my legal guardian. You attached a letter from a doctor named Felt, a doctor who has never examined me, never taken my blood pressure, never shaken my hand. The colour went out of her face, the way the colour had gone out of Chase's, except hers went white instead of grey. I saw her hands start to shake against the tablecloth. Ivan, sitting beside me the whole time, hadn't said a word, but I felt him go rigid in his chair at that. The same stillness he gets right before he opens a panel he already suspects is going to be bad. How did you? Paige started. I watched her realise, mid-sentence, that the question didn't matter anymore. The how was never going to change the what. I told her I wasn't angry at her. Not entirely. Not in the way I was at the man sitting beside her. I told her I understood, or was trying hard to understand, that fear does strange things to a person's judgment. Somebody had clearly fed her a story about protecting me that made betraying me feel like love. She looked at Chase then. I watched 12 years of marriage compress into one look. The look a person gives someone when they, finally, all at once, see the whole shape of what they've been standing next to. You told me it was to protect him, she said to Chase. Quiet, almost to herself. You said if something happened to him suddenly, without a guardian in place, everything could get tied up in probate for years. You said it was just paperwork, just in case. Chase didn't answer her. He was still looking at Marjorie's papers, at the trust document sitting open on the table between the water glasses and the half-eaten pork loin. Like a man reading a wiring diagram for a fire he'd started without knowing which wall it was behind. I let the silence sit there a moment. Doreen taught me that too, without ever saying it in so many words. Let a hard fact sit in a room by itself. Don't decorate it. Don't rush to soften it. Just let it finish landing before you say the next thing. Then Marjorie reached into the briefcase one more time, pulled out the last item, the one I'd asked her to save for exactly this moment. It was a single sheet of paper, sealed in a plastic sleeve, a photocopy of a page from a ledger, written in handwriting none of them recognised but me. I said, before Marjorie read it, I want you all to know this was written 4 years ago. Before any of this. Before a guardianship petition. Before a doctor's letter. Before a toast about beer money. My wife wrote this the year she got sick. She wrote it about a man she'd only known for a few years. She had a gift I never had, for seeing straight through a person before the rest of us caught up. Marjorie read it out loud, slow. The whole table gone silent enough that I could hear the kitchen clock ticking behind us, the same brand as the one on my own mantel, though it wasn't the one that mattered. W. If the day ever comes they call it beer money, hand them the folder, let them count it themselves. D. Nobody spoke for a long moment after that. Chase stared at the page like it might rearrange itself into something less true if he looked hard enough. Paige had started crying. Quiet. The kind of crying that isn't for show. The kind that comes when a person finally understands exactly how much they've lost and how much of the losing was their own hand on the wheel. I looked at my daughter. I said the thing I'd been saving for this exact second. The only thing in that whole folder that mattered more to me than every dollar figure combined. I said, your mother knew, Paige. 4 years before any of this, she already knew. She still wanted you protected. She never once wrote a word against you in that whole ledger, only against the day somebody might try to use you to get at what we built. Paige put her face in her hands. Chase sat very still, the colour still not back in his face, staring at a trust document that had just quietly closed every door he'd spent 2 years trying to pry open. Somewhere behind me, in the kitchen, the pork loin sat cooling on the stove. Doreen's recipe, filling a house that had just changed shape around everyone sitting in it, except me. Nobody ate the rest of that dinner. Marjorie stayed another 20 minutes, answering the practical questions that came slow at first and then all at once. The way questions come once a person finally understands the size of the thing sitting in front of them. Paige asked whether the guardianship petition could simply be withdrawn. Marjorie told her yes, that same week if she chose. A petitioner can withdraw a filing any time before a hearing is scheduled. Doing so promptly, before the court ever had to weigh in, would likely be the cleanest way to close that particular door without further cost to anyone. Paige said she'd withdraw it Monday morning, first thing. I believed her. I still believe her today. Chase asked, quieter now, almost defeated, whether there was any way I'd consider helping with the brewery loan. Not as a gift, he said, fast, like he already knew how that request would land in this room. As a loan, real terms, whatever I wanted to charge him. I told him no. Plain. No cruelty in it. Just a fact laid flat on the table, same as every other fact that night. I told him I'd spent 51 years building something honest. I wasn't going to attach a single dollar of it to a man who'd spent the last 2 years trying to take it instead of asking for it. I told him that door had been open once, a long time. He'd walked past it every single time he chose silence, and a lawyer's letter over a phone call to me. He nodded. He didn't argue. I think some part of him had already known walking into that dinner that this was the answer he'd get. Some smaller part of him, the part that had asked, anyway, was maybe hoping I'd surprise him. I didn't. Some men need to lose a thing all the way down before they understand what carrying it honestly would have felt like. Marjorie left around 6 that evening, her briefcase lighter than she'd carried it in. I walked her to her car myself. She told me standing in the cool evening air that I'd handled it exactly the way she'd have advised. If I'd ever asked her advice on the manner of it, which of course I hadn't. Some things a man has to do in his own voice, or not at all. I want to tell you what happened in the 17 days after that dinner. The story doesn't end at the table, no matter how much that scene feels, in the telling. Like the whole shape of the thing. Paige withdrew the guardianship petition that Monday, exactly as she'd said she would. She drove to the courthouse herself alone and signed the withdrawal in front of the clerk. The same Ardis Kellerman who'd been feeding me small true facts for weeks, without ever once realising how much weight they'd carry. Ardis told me later, over the phone, that Paige had cried in her office a few minutes before signing. Quiet tears. The kind of person cries when they're finally doing the right thing, after weeks of doing the wrong one. The equipment lender moved on schedule. 17 days after that dinner, right on the date Marjorie had calculated weeks before, a crew arrived at Merrick Brewhouse and hauled out all 4 tanks and the walk-in cooler, exactly as the notice had promised. Chase's partner Boyd Wickstrom dissolved the partnership within the month, citing what he told the county paper was irreconcilable differences in financial judgment. That struck me, reading it, as about as honest a sentence as a business notice ever manages. Chase kept the taproom's shell, the building itself, though without tanks or a cooler it wasn't much of a brewery anymore. Last I heard, he'd taken a job managing the floor at a hardware store 2 towns over. 40 hours a week, steady pay, no ownership stake, no glass to raise at anybody's expense but his own. I won't pretend I take pleasure in that. I take something closer to a quiet, settled recognition. A man who spent 2 years trying to build his life on borrowed weight finally found himself carrying only what was actually his to carry. Which is, in the end, exactly what every one of us deserves. No more. No less. The trust held, exactly as Marjorie had built it to hold. Ivan's note kept paying. $4,100, first of every month, same as it always had. Same as it always will, until the note itself runs its course in another 11 years. The shop building stayed mine. The land beneath it stayed mine. Depot Street still backs up to that rail spur. I still turn down the same developer every couple years when he calls to ask if I've changed my mind. I want to tell you about Paige now. Her part of this story matters more to me than any figure in that folder ever did. She came to see me alone, 3 weeks after that dinner. No Chase, no children in tow, just her. Sitting across my kitchen table where her mother used to keep the books. She told me she and Chase were separating. Not divorcing yet, she said, though I suspect that's where it's headed. Living apart while they sorted out what was left worth saving. She told me she'd spent the 3 weeks since that dinner going back through everything. Every conversation, every small dismissal, every time Chase had told her not to worry about the numbers. She'd realised how much of their marriage had been built on her simply trusting a man who'd never once earned that particular trust the way he should have. I told her I was proud of her for seeing it plain, even this late, even at this cost. I told her plain seeing is worth more than almost anything else a person can offer another person. Her mother would have told her the exact same thing, in fewer words and warmer ones than I manage. She asked me, quiet, whether I could ever forgive Chase. I told her the truth. I told her forgiveness wasn't mine to give on that scale. Not for what he'd done to her, only for what he'd done to me. Even that forgiveness, if it ever came, would take longer than a Sunday dinner to arrive at. I told her I could forgive a desperate man for panicking. I wasn't sure yet. I could forgive a husband for turning his own wife into a weapon against her own father. I told her that distinction mattered. She ought to sit with it herself before she decided what she was willing to forgive. She nodded. She understood. I think in some way, she'd been waiting a long while for somebody to finally say that distinction out loud, instead of everybody around her softening it into something easier to live with. I asked her about the children. My grandchildren. 2 of them, a boy and a girl, 12 and 9. 12. She told me they were confused, scared, the way children get when the ground under a house starts shifting and nobody explains why. I told her to bring them by the shop sometime soon. Told her I'd teach the boy how to strip a wire clean, same as I taught her once, long before Chase, long before any of this. Back when she still corrected her teachers polite and never once doubted that a true fact was worth saying out loud. She said she would. She has twice now since that conversation. I'll tell you, watching that boy's small hands learn to hold a wire stripper steady is about the closest thing to pure joy I've felt since Doreen passed. I want to tell you about the door I left open for Paige, the one I decided on weeks before that dinner even happened, sitting in my truck outside the shop in the dark. That door is still open. It'll stay open as long as I'm alive to keep it that way. Not for Chase. That door closed on its own the moment he chose silence over honesty, over and over, for 2 straight years. But for my daughter, the door stays open. She is still my daughter, still the little girl who corrected her 2nd grade teacher, still capable, I believe, of becoming again the woman her mother raised her to be. I've thought a great deal these past weeks about the word confused, about how a paid doctor's signature tried to make that word stick to me, tried to make it the truth instead of the lie it always was. I want to say plain one more time for anyone listening who's ever had that word aimed at them by somebody who stood to gain from it landing. A man does not go soft in the mind just because he's carried heavy things for 51 years. If anything, he gets sharper about what's load-bearing and what only looks that way. He spent a whole life learning the difference the hard way, one bad connection at a time. There's a piece of this I haven't told you yet. I've been saving it. It belongs at the end, not the middle, the way you save the last coat of finish for after everything underneath has had time to cure proper. About a month after that dinner, Ivan Koch showed up at my house on a Saturday morning, unannounced, which he almost never does. He had something wrapped in an old shop rag. He set it on my kitchen table without much ceremony, the way he sets most things down, plain and unhurried. It was a small brass plate, the kind you'd screw onto a piece of equipment to mark it. He'd had it engraved himself, at his own expense, at the same shop in Anders Junction that used to do our nameplates back when Voss Electrical still ran under my name, day to day. It read, Voss Electrical, founded 1975, W. Voss D. Voss. He told me he wanted it mounted on the shop's front door, right below the current sign, so that anybody walking in from now on would see both our names together. Not just mine. I didn't say much when I saw it. I've never been a man who cries easy. I didn't cry then either, not exactly. But I sat at that table a long while with that little brass plate in my hands, tracing the letters of Doreen's name with my thumb. I thought about 30 years of her keeping the books honest at that same kitchen table, never once asking for her name to be on anything, content just to see the thing itself run clean. We mounted it together the following Tuesday, Ivan and I, two old men on a stepladder outside a building we'd both given the better part of our lives to. It took maybe 10 minutes. It's still there. I drive by it most mornings, same as I always have. I always look at it a second longer than I need to. I want to tell you about the last conversation I had with Paige before I sat down to tell you any of this. It feels like the right place to close. She came by 2 Sundays ago, alone again. We sat on my porch a long while, the same porch I'd sat on the night before that dinner, working through everything that had led to it. She told me the divorce was finalised, told me she'd taken a part-time bookkeeping job at a feed store in town, said she wanted to learn to keep her own numbers straight from now on. Never again wanted to be a woman who didn't know the real figure behind a word like steady. I told her that was the smartest thing I'd heard her say in a long while. I meant it plain. No compliment softening it. Just a true thing said out loud. She asked me, near the end of that visit, whether I regretted any of it. The dinner, the folder, the way it all came out at once, in front of her children's father, in front of Ivan, in front of a lawyer who'd known our whole family's business for 13 years. I told her no. I told her I regretted only one thing. It wasn't the manner of how it came out. It was that it had to come out at all. Somewhere along the way, a family I'd spent 51 years building honest had let a stranger's fear and a stranger's debt get close enough to nearly take it apart. I set Doreen's old metronome ticking on the little table between us, the way I do most evenings. I told Paige something her mother used to say to me, back before either of us had any money worth arguing over, back when the panel van was still new and the tools in it still smelled like the hardware store. She used to say, "Wendell, we're not building this for what it's worth someday. We're building it so nobody can ever tell either of us we didn't try." I told Paige that's still the truest thing I know, not the $610,000, not the shop, not the land, not even the trust that held every bit of it clean, through the worst thing that's happened to this family since her mother passed. The truest thing is that a person can spend an entire life building something with their own 2 hands. Quiet, patient, one honest connection at a time. And nobody, not a son-in-law circling for collateral, not a paid doctor's signature, not a courthouse filing sitting quiet in a drawer, gets to call that beer money and have it stick. I never raised my voice through any of it. Not at the toast. Not at the shop. Not at that dinner table when the whole thing finally came apart in front of everyone sitting there. I didn't need to. I've said it different ways across this whole telling. I'll say it once more, plain, the way I'd explain a wiring diagram to the last apprentice I ever train. I never threw a punch in my life. I never raised a fist at anybody. Not once. Not even close. The only tools I've ever needed were patience and a clear head, and the plain truth, laid out flat on a table where everyone sitting there could see it for exactly what it was. Chase Merrick learned that the hard way, the way most men learn the hardest lessons, only after they've already lost the thing they were gambling with. My daughter is learning it slower, gentler, the way a person relearns a truth they always half knew, but let themselves forget for a while. And I'm still here, 70 years old, still driving out to that shop most mornings just to stand in it a minute, still winding Doreen's metronome at 6 every evening, still keeping the books in my own hand, in my own ledger, exactly the way she taught me, so that no matter what anybody ever calls it, I always know precisely whose numbers I'm looking at. I want to tell you one more small thing before I close this out. It matters more to me than it probably should to anyone listening. Last month, my grandson, Paige's boy, the one I'm teaching to strip a wire clean, asked me why I never took Chase to court over any of it. 12 years old, already asking a question sharper than most grown men manage. I told him the truth. I told him a courtroom would have cost this family more than it ever could have given back. I told him the trust did the only job I ever needed it to do, make sure nobody could take what wasn't theirs. Once that job was done, chasing a man through a courtroom for the satisfaction of it would have just been spending good money to buy a feeling that fades by morning anyway. He thought about that a long while, the way a serious child thinks. Then he asked me if I'd ever help somebody the way Ivan helps me, once he's grown and has something of his own worth protecting. I told him that's exactly the point of everything I've ever built. Not to hoard it, not to grip it tight against every hand that reaches, just to build it honest enough that it's worth passing on. Pass it to people who've earned the trust to carry it forward the same way it was carried to them. He nodded serious and went back to stripping his wire. Careful, patient, the exact way I taught him, the exact way his grandmother once taught his mother to keep a column honest, one true number at a time. The last thing I want to tell you is this. A few evenings ago, I sat on my porch alone. No company but the metronome ticking on the little table beside me. I watched the sun go down over Redbud Crossing, the way I've watched it go down for 70 years now. Slow, orange, settling behind the same tree line I've known my whole life. I thought about the toast, about the word beer money, about how small that phrase looks now, set against everything it turned out to be measuring. I picked up my coffee, same as I did the morning after that first dinner. I said it out loud to nobody in particular, the way a man talks to an empty porch when the only person he really wants to hear him has been gone 3 years now. I said, Doreen, they finally counted it themselves. Then I sat there a while longer, listening to the metronome keep its steady time. The same rhythm it's kept every evening since she left me. I let the quiet do what quiet has always done best in this family. It settled everything, plain and true, exactly where it belonged.